Good. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I want to thank you all for coming. Just to introduce myself, my name is Ben Buttrick, and I am currently the chair of the Essex Finance Committee. I've been on the Finance Committee for 7 years. It's starting to sink in. This is a little, municipal finance is a murky area to dip your toes in, and so I want to thank you all for coming tonight because I know municipal finance is not necessarily at the top of everybody's excitement list, but hey, it's January, right? And so, so thanks for coming out. We have about an hour's worth, maybe less, of prepared material, and then we have time for discussion and question and answer, and really want to make this interactive. So I'll try and be sequential just in terms of questions that come up in any discussion, but I'm going to be a little bit relaxed in terms of Robert's rules because I really want this to be participative. A little bit of background in terms of how this came about. Oh, sorry. Oh, we should go into session. Yeah.
6:03, I will call the Board of Selectmen meeting to order. Go ahead. You better call us.
All right, and we should also call the Finance Committee into session. We may have 4 of us, which would be a quorum. So I'll make a motion to go into session of the Essex Finance Committee.
So moved.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you. All right. So the purpose of tonight is to go over some of the basic concepts around municipal finance in terms of how the town operates, focusing on things like Proposition 2.5, what is the levy limit, how do assessments work, why are my taxes what they are, what role do my taxes, our taxes play in terms of the functioning of the town, and what are the various constraints that the town operates under with respect to taxation. I got my January tax bill. I think most residents have received their tax bill, and it's kind of an interesting year because a lot of the assessment numbers have gone up, and the tax rate has gone down, and that's sort of a curiosity that people have. I mean, in my particular situation, my assessment went up by 5.5%. My tax bill is going up by 1.2% because of that mill rate interplay with valuation. So how does that work? Why is that? And that's sort of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're also going to cover things like free cash. What is free cash? What is the difference between operating and capital expenses? And we'll try and make it exciting, right? So the extent to which we can do that, I think, is successful. So those are the objectives. The other thing I was going to mention is that this is really designed for Essex residents because as part of our objectives for tonight, let me just try and advance my slides. So we'll kind of lay out the laws of the land. So basically how municipalities work in Massachusetts, and then talk about what's unique about Essex structurally. We're a really small town relative to other municipalities in the state, so that creates some quirks and some challenges, so we'll talk about that. And then it's just, we'll open it up for questions. So this is basically a list of all the material that we're going to cover tonight. And I actually wanted to kick off this session by just playing a video. It's 8 minutes long. It's a little bit hokey. It's the Division of Local Services. Basically, local finance in Massachusetts is overseen by the Massachusetts Division of Local Services. So things like the management of Proposition 2.5 and the assessment process and how tax rates are calculated, reporting, etc., all is overseen by the Department of Local Services. They have a whole series of materials and primers, and that is sort of the core of a lot of what is being used tonight. So I will attempt to play the video. Hopefully it'll work.
You click the link up there.
What's that? Wait, I think it's just delayed. There we go. All right, hopefully this isn't too loud when it comes through, but.
Like most households and businesses, local governments must manage a stream of revenue and expenses to ensure that services are delivered to its constituents. Municipal expenses vary by type and by community and include education, public safety, public works, and other costs. To budget for and fund these expenses, cities and towns rely on different revenue streams, including property taxes and local receipts such as meal and motor vehicle excise. Municipalities also receive local aid from the state and may use their own financial reserves for these costs as well. Property taxes are the most significant revenue source for Massachusetts municipalities, as they are the primary revenue source for all cities and towns across the Commonwealth. On average, property taxes account for over 70% of local budgets. Therefore, understanding Proposition 2.5, a statewide law that governs property tax assessment, is a key part of municipal budgeting and management. Approved by Massachusetts voters in 1980, Proposition 2.5 sets limits on the amount of property tax that can be collected or levied by a city or town annually. It outlines how new growth in the tax base can be identified and sets guidelines for levy limit overrides, underrides, and exclusions. A detailed walkthrough of Proposition 2.5 can be found on DLS's Municipal Finance Training and Resource Center. Since property taxes are the primary source of revenue for Massachusetts municipalities, the assessor serves as a key member of a community's financial management team. Among their other duties, the assessor prepares and maintains an accurate property database and classifies real estate into 4 classes: residential, commercial, industrial, and open space. They also determine the valuation of property as of the January 1st assessment date, which requires knowledge of various appraisal methodologies. Once a municipality's tax rate and property valuations are approved, the assessors also prepare a tax list and warrant and commit taxes to the collector. They also grant abatements and exemptions to taxpayers who must file timely applications with the assessors and administer motor vehicle and other excise bills. The assessor works closely with the collector, as well as other members of the financial management team. As we will see, teamwork amongst local officials is essential to effective financial management in every community. Let's look at just a few of the responsibilities of other local officials. The tax collector is responsible for billing and collecting all taxes committed by the assessor. As mentioned, the collector receives the tax commitment from the assessor, sends bills to taxpayers, and collects corresponding payments. In some communities, the collector collects not just taxes, but all accounts due to the municipality, such as water and sewer bills. Once collected, funds are turned over to the treasurer, who is the custodian of all municipal funds. The treasurer is responsible for the deposit, investment, and disbursement of municipal funds. They work with the community's financial advisor and bond counsel and supervise the debt issuance process. The treasurer also manages the tax title process once the collector has made a tax taking as the result of an unpaid bill. The accountant or auditor records all of the financial transactions of the municipality. They use this information to prepare financial reports like the balance sheet submission in Schedule A for review by the Division of Local Services. The accountant auditor also prepares interim reports for the community to consider during the fiscal year to assist in budgeting, and also notifies departments monthly of unspent and unencumbered appropriation balances. All bills for payment are approved by the accountant auditor, who monitors spending to assure that goods have been delivered and services have been rendered. These and other members of the financial management team work together with other appointed or elected officials who oversee and manage local government. But who are these other elected or appointed officials? This depends on whether the community is a city or a town. In most towns, an elected select board serves as the chief executive branch with responsibility for developing overall policy and coordinating the general operations of town government. The select board appoints certain officials in the town, whether it be in accordance with state statute, a charter provision, or local bylaw. The select board issues town meeting warrants and negotiates collective bargaining agreements for all departments, except schools, and approves vendor and payroll warrants for payment by the treasurer. The select board also prepares or reviews budget proposals for town meeting approval. These budget responsibilities are usually shared with the Finance Committee, a body that advises town meeting on financial matters. The board also plays a role in tax policy by voting to place a Proposition 2.5 override, debt exclusion, or capital outlay exclusion question on the ballot. The legislative body of a town is town meeting. As the appropriating authority of a town, town meeting adopts the budget and authorizes debt issuances. Town meeting also has local lawmaking authority through the enactment of bylaws. Most towns have a chief administrative officer that oversees its day-to-day operations. This person is usually referred to as the town administrator or town manager. As with other roles, the responsibilities of this individual vary by community, but will typically involve the coordination of the financial operations of the town. Other duties are likely to be assigned by the select board as needed. In a city, the mayor or city manager is the chief executive officer. The mayor or city manager has all the duties of the select board in towns, including appointing authority and oversight of administration and finances. In a city, however, this individual prepares and submits the budget to the city council, which can then only approve, reduce, or reject the mayor's budget proposal. The city council is the legislative branch in a city, and is the municipality's appropriating authority, which adopts a budget and authorizes debt. It also has lawmaking authority through the enactment of ordinances. City council plays a role in tax policy by placing Proposition 2.5 questions on the ballot with the mayor's approval. We've reviewed just some of the responsibilities of local officials who play an important role in the financial management of their communities, which requires collaboration amongst a financial management team. For more information, visit the Division of Local Services website at mass.gov/DLS. There you can find the Municipal Finance Training and Resource Center, and find more information about roles and responsibilities of local officials and best practices for municipal financial management. You can also visit DLS's YouTube page.
All right. Promise, that's the only video we're going to watch tonight. But I just thought it introduces a lot of the concepts just in a pretty efficient way. I mean, actually, a lot of what was stated in there does, in terms of how towns operate, it does apply to Essex in terms of how all the different parties work together, and as well as the various concepts: revenues, expenses, reserves, Proposition 2.5, the assessor, the role of the assessor, tax rates. And that's pretty much all what we're going to discuss. I wanted to just start, this is actually from the Finance Committee report that gets generated before town meeting. I wanted to start with revenues. They said in the video that typically property taxes account for 70% or more of a municipality's incoming revenues. That's certainly true in Essex. In fact, taxation accounts for more than 70%. As you can see here, it's 74%, but that's actually just property and personal tax. If you factor in excise tax, motor vehicles excise tax, you factor in meals tax, hotel taxes, etc., which show up in the green slice, then we're looking in excess of 80% in terms of reliance on taxes as a source of revenue. What I did here was I separated out water and sewer. Water and sewer is its own enterprise in terms of money coming in and money going out in terms of their expense structure. So if you want to look at the two together, our annual budget is $23 million. If you separate out the water and sewer, we're just under 20 million, as you can see here. The tax levy, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, and try and define some of the terminology that you hear get used. But our tax levy, as you can see, in terms of property taxes, runs about 3/4 of our revenue. So, in fact, if you look at our tax levy number, it's between 14 and 15 million right now. So it sort of fits in with looking at the revenue picture for the town. All right, so now I'm not going to play the video, but I do want to just delve into Proposition 2.5. I think most people understand that when we refer to the tax levy, that's basically the money that's coming in through taxation, through property taxation. That is a single number. It's in the 14 to 15 million range right now, and I'll go specifically through the exact numbers for Essex. Proposition 2.5 at its core, and it was set up in 1980, as the video said, because Massachusetts had the nickname of Taxachusetts, and we had sort of a runaway taxation problem, and part of that was at the property tax level because there was really no check or ceiling in terms of the ability for municipalities to tax residents. Basically, what it did was it put into place a limit saying you can only increase your tax levy, that dollar amount, by 2.5% per year. And that's why it's called Proposition 2.5. So I think what's confusing is most people think, well, my tax bill shouldn't be going up by 2.5%. And there are some quirks about Proposition 2.5, and that's what I wanted to talk about, what are the quirks that cause that. So the tax levy that we've defined, the tax limit is basically the amount that the municipality has the ability to tax up to. And it's a function of Proposition 2.5. I'll define it on the right there, which basically you have the levy, the tax levy, and if you take the prior year's limit, or the amount up to which you can tax, Proposition 2.5 says, well, you can grow it by 2.5% as a baseline, and then you are allowed something called new growth, which I'll define on the next slide, but it's basically new building, new developments, anything that hasn't been assessed or part of the tax levy that's introduced, then that's considered new growth. That's part of the role of the assessor, is to define what that new growth is. The other thing, the other sort of quirk about Proposition 2.5 is you can go up by more than 2.5% plus new growth, if you think about that sort of as the baseline, by doing something called an override. And I think we all hear these terms. We had our own override experience last spring. So the override basically requires voter approval as an exception to the Proposition 2.5 rules, the 2.5% plus new growth. And so that's basically how Proposition 2.5 works. We operate under a 2.5% model. Part of the issue is when we plan our budgets each year, and there's a seasonality to our budget process. We typically plan our annual operating budget for each fiscal year starting now and basically running through the spring. And coming up, we have fiscal 25. So right now we are in fiscal 24. Fiscal 24 actually starts July 1st of the prior year. And we don't actually know what that new growth is going to be when we're planning for that next year. So that's one of the quirks about Proposition 2.5 is you can sort of guess at what you think your new growth is going to be based on what it is, but you don't actually have those numbers when you're doing the budget work from year to year. So new growth, overrides, we've talked about that. And then here's the really sort of tricky part. There's this term called excess capacity or levy capacity. So what happens is a municipality doesn't have to tax up to what that levy limit is. And a lot of times municipalities, in the desire to be conservative, will tax up to a certain level and leave a little bit of excess capacity. And also you don't know what the new growth is going to be in advance, right? So you find out about that after the fact. The extent to which you don't tax up to the full levy limit, you can actually carry that forward to the next year. And then you can do that again the next year and carry it forward to the following year. And we've gone for a whole string of years in Essex, carrying forward our excess capacity. So when we had the override for the district last spring and it didn't pass, we were able to use that excess levy capacity. And so what happens is that means that our taxes have gone up by more than 2.5% plus new growth. Our taxes have gone up 2.5% plus new growth, plus the override did pass for the tech, it did not pass for the district, so there was a small override that did pass, and then we had this excess levy capacity. So the average taxpayer in Essex likely saw about 7% of an increase. And that's been triggering questions because people are like, well, how can that be? We didn't pass the override and we operate under Proposition 2.5. It's because we had a whole string of years with which we had that carry forward levy capacity. And so that's one of the factors at play. I also took the definition of new growth. This is from the DLS. It's pretty much what I said. It's new development that it could be condo conversions or something that is basically either wasn't subject to tax during the prior assessment or was taxed in a different sort of way. And it gets kind of technical, but I think for our purposes tonight, that's basically all we need to know. What I wanted to do is to lay out the numbers for Essex. So our levy limit was for fiscal 23. Remember, we're now in fiscal 24. So this was last year's levy limit. We were at 14.02 million. You get the 2.5% growth, so it grows by 350,000. We have the override for Essex Tech, which was passed, which is another 56,000. And then we assumed new growth of 100K. Again, at the time, we didn't know actually what that new growth would be. So our levy limit went from 14 up to 14,520. So if you just take a percentage increase from 14.02 million to 14.53 million, then that's an increase of 3.62. But then we had the 435,000 of excess capacity, which was also applied, and that brings us up to closer to a 7% number for the town. And so, I'm going to talk about the assessment process, because all we're talking about is the whole bucket. All the properties in the town, basically, this is the levy. This is what's collected from all the different properties in the town. Everyone's individual experience is going to be different, and I'll explain that. But I should probably pause, because this is pretty technical, and even though we have time for Q&A, I just want to see if anybody has any questions about any of these definitions or how Proposition 2.5 actually works.
Sure.
Brian.
So Brian Russell, 30 Joe. So you said it, but Brian Gressler, 30 Joe. You said it, but you didn't quite say it. So I think my question to you is, 2.5 is a arbitrary number. Would you agree with this statement? Is an arbitrary number that that creates a line in the sand against which a voter check occurs and is not tied to any real world metric or like inflation or anything like that. So it's just it has nothing to do with actual finance and how much things cost. It only has to do with, we had to pick a number somewhere where we say, before this, we don't need voter input. After this, we need voter input.
Yes, I agree with that. It is a hard-coded number, which is a little bit curious because, this law was enacted at a time when inflation rates were really high in the early 1980s, and we've been in a period of disinflation since then. Looking on a long-term, multi-decade macro basis, we've been in a period of disinflation, up until 2021, late 21 into 22, when we saw the spike in inflation. So it's a little bit of it's a tricky time period right now in terms of operating under this constraint. So it'll be interesting.
That would explain why you've been able to carry some excess capacity for years until you hit a point where some of your other costs might have gone up relative to inflation, and now you're eating into that.
That's right. And I would also say, and we'll kind of get into the town expenses too. We've been pretty conservative in terms of our budget assumptions around town expenses, which I'll talk about. But it has allowed the flexibility, which actually was helpful this past spring. I think the takeaway from this is that you should always assume 2.5% is sort of the framework that we're operating under, plus anywhere from 0.5 to a percentage point on top of that. So, if we have new growth, it could be, we're looking at 3.5% as we don't know that in advance of that happening. So from a budget planning standpoint, we usually don't factor in new growth because at the time of the planning, it's an unknown. So, and then you all know about overrides and heard about, you understand the idea of overrides in concept. Overrides can be for both operating purposes and then debt overrides, which are another type of exclusion to Prop 2.5. But I'm not going to get into debt right now, but there's just different types of overrides. But I think the excess levy capacity is probably the most head-scratching concept for most people. So I just wanted to be clear about that. All right. So the Board of Assessors is responsible for doing valuation assessments on property. Each year that valuation is published. It was just published, and you can look it up by address, and that there's a whole framework with which assessments get done, and there's a whole sort of playbook for how you actually handle assessments, and it's not across the board. Obviously, it depends on the type of property. One of the things that can impact assessments are things like additions to a house, anything that's going to require a homeowner investment to add value to the property, theoretically would be subject to increasing the assessment. So I don't want to get into the intricacies of how assessments are done, other than just knowing that it varies by individual property owner. And then this sort of gets into defining what the tax rate is, or what's called the mill rate. This is another area of real confusion for people. When people see their tax bills going up, but then they see the mill rate going down, it doesn't mean that the town's tax levy is going down with a lower mill rate. It's a mathematical quirk in terms of how the tax rate, the mill rate, actually gets defined. So what happens is you have the tax levy, that, the whole bucket, which is under the control of the rules around Proposition 2.5 in terms of how that levy can grow. So if you assume no new growth, no overrides, no excess capacity, the levy grows by 2.5%, right? But property values, particularly in the last few years, like in some cases, property values have been going up 10, 15, 20% over the last few years. So how does that get reconciled? What happens is the tax levy can go up by 2.5%, but assessments could go up by 15%. And what that means is that your tax rate is going to be lower, because the tax rate is simply mathematically taking the tax levy and dividing by the total assessment of the town. And the tax rate basically is the total assessment divided by 1,000, because it's calculated as the amount of tax per $1,000. So this is tricky. I'm not expecting you to understand that, just in terms of giving a definition. So I did a little illustration here. This is a pretend town with 3 houses. And you can see the 3 houses are stacked up there. If you add up the assessment of those 3 houses, you get $1,875,000. You have a tax levy, and don't read into the interplay between these numbers. This is just our starting point. The tax levy is $22,500. So if you take $22,500 and you divide it by the total valuation divided by 1,000, so you take $22,500 and you divide it by $1,875, you're going to get $12. That's the mill rate. So if we go to year 2, tax levy goes up by 2.5%. And just to keep this illustration simple, subject to the rules of Proposition 2.5. We now have those 3 houses. The house at the top went up by 10%, worth $550. The house in the middle went up by less than 10%, went up by $25,000. And the bottom house went up by $25,000. You total all of those up, you get $1,975,000. So the total has gone up by $100,000. If you take the tax levy and you divide by the total valuation of those houses, divided by 1,000, the total valuation divided by 1,000, you get a tax rate of 11.78. Or sorry, 11.68. So does everybody understand that math? Basically, it's the tax levy is kind of separately managed, the whole bucket, and then the assessments are done through a whole methodology to assess values. The tax rate is just the result of a mathematical equation. And so year 2 is kind of simple. Year 3, we've introduced some new growth. we've added a house to our town. So that brings the total valuation, it jumps way up by 450,000. The tax levy went up by 2.5% plus some new growth, which was allowed under the rules around the assessment, or under the rules around Proposition 2.5 as a result of the assessment process. The tax levy spiked up, but the tax rate went down, even though the community was growing. So, and it's the same math all the way through. So literally, Jody had sent me the Essex, the page that has the total valuations of the town and the tax levy, and I did the same calculation, divided it, got our new tax rate, which is 1332. So it's just math, basically, that determines the tax rate. If the mill rate's going up or down, doesn't make any difference, really, because every individual taxpayer, based on their assessment experience and their home value, is going to have a slightly different experience. I think that is confusing to a lot of people. So, yeah. Questions? Oh my gosh, this is great. I feel like I've cracked that nut. Hopefully this won't take an hour to get through. All right, so I just wanted to get on to expenditures of the town. So we have that money coming in. That money coming in is largely through taxation, as we just talked about, and then local receipts, that slice of the pie. We also have money coming in from other sources, state aid. Also, if we do a bond issue, there'll be some money coming in, although that's usually for capital expenditures. But we have to pay the debt service, and that shows up on the slice here. But I don't think Essex is all that different from many towns in Massachusetts. If you look at the breakdown of where money gets spent, far and away, education is the top expenditure for the town. Biggest slice there. And then public safety, which rolls up fire, police, emergency response, etc. And then debt service is showing up as 11%. That's actually coming down because I'm going to show you the debt schedule shortly. As debt rolls off, the debt service, until you have a new bond issue, debt service will typically come down over time. And then you can sort of see the rest of the expenses. One of the things that I was just going to mention that is the role of the Finance Committee is this looks very simple in terms of the roll-ups, but we look at literally hundreds of line items. So all of the different departments have individual line items that are typically either personnel related or they're expense related, meaning supplies, non sort of human costs. So that's our town. You can see the expenditures. Basically, we're a municipality, right? So the expenditures generally have to match up with our revenues. But the extent to which they don't is free cash, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Just a quick delve into operating versus capital expense. I had referenced before sort of the seasonality. The annual budget that we go through in planning for each year those are recurring expenses to the town. So those recur over time. Capital expenses are items that are sort of one-time expenses. Even though the debt service will require, ongoing, that will be part of our annual expenses. generally speaking, one-time expenses are capital and typically involve borrowing or could be funded through use of reserves, versus operating, which is generally recurring. Again, these are DLS definitions up here, so I just thought it would be helpful to reference that. Free cash. So when our expenditures at the end of, on June 30th of at the end of each fiscal year, when we go through what are the expenditures, what were the outlays for the town versus the money that came in, whatever that difference is gets qualified and has to be certified by is it the Department of Revenue that does this? Yeah, that has to be sort of certified free cash. Our free cash has been running fairly high, and it gets back to conservatively managing budgets, but a lot of that also is we don't always know what the revenue is going to be coming in again until after the fact. So things like meals tax, hotel tax, we can't assume, we have to be very conservative in terms of our assumptions for revenue coming in. And then we can also manage our budgets. And so that in recent years has resulted in a fairly sizable amount of free cash. But free cash is basically just the differential. Free cash is basically like the savings, right? At the amount that you've accumulated during the course of the year. That free cash can be deployed, and that is typically we do that in the fall because we know what that free cash number is. It gets certified in either October. Sometimes it gets kind of close to town meeting, and we're guessing what we think our free cash is, and then that money gets deployed. Typically, that money gets deployed for things like, for example, a new fire truck, as was the case this past November. We also we make annual contributions into something called OPEB, which is it's other post-employment benefits, i.e. healthcare for retired workers, retired town workers, and basically we have to fund that liability from the town. So we put money away, and that money is to cover that future liability. We have some discretion in terms of what we can put in each year. Our OPEB fund is actually very well funded in terms of relative to other municipalities, which is great, because if it's not, then it's a little bit of a ticking time bomb, because once that liability has to be paid out, you need to have the money there. It's also one of the few parts of our budget that can actually be invested in stocks and bonds. Generally speaking, municipal budgets are very limited in terms of where the money can be invested. It has to be in conservative cash equivalent instruments, maybe some short-term treasuries, but we can't be speculating with municipal dollars. And so most of our funds, and I'm going to talk about reserves in a moment, sit in just interest-bearing accounts. So they've started to earn a little bit more interest recently as interest rates have gone up. One of the questions, I know this came up in terms of wanting to use free cash for operating expenses, and it's not prohibited, it's not considered a best practice. And I put a little illustration together here because annual budgets grow. They're recurring costs, and so they're always going to go up over time. If you fund that from a source of savings, either through any of our reserve funds, including free cash, then you have to fund it each year. So the only time that it's really appropriate to do that is if you imminently know that you're going to have a source of new revenue coming online, and so therefore you're kind of using it in kind of an interim or sort of a one-off basis to cover that future recurring expense. But generally speaking, the budget gets covered through taxation, which is allowed to grow pretty much as expenses grow, although sometimes you get some mismatches. All right, reserves. Our town is kind of unique. A lot of towns might have 3 or 4 different reserve funds. We have like a dozen or more. Jody referred to it as, what is it called? The envelope?
The envelope method.
The envelope method of, you're stuffing an envelope in terms of putting money away for different purposes. And so what I did was I took all of our reserve balances. It may be kind of hard to see what those numbers are, but this shows the balance of our reserves. The bar chart is as of September 30th, but the data labels are actually after town meeting because we appropriated funds in town meeting. So for example, you can look at the bar chart for free cash, which is the 5th one from the left, and you can see it was, 2.4 million. The data label says almost 750,000, which is the green part of the bar. So the orange part is basically money that we allocated from free cash. And so we make these moves at town meeting. You can see, such and such is being funded, from free cash or going from one fund to a certain expense. The OPEB trust fund, I think we funded at 175,000. So that's actually negative, the little orange bar, because money went in. But these are the balances all the way down to, we seeded a climate change fund. They're just little buckets for different purposes, basically. And Brendan, some of these require 2/3 vote to use. Some require simple majority. Is that right? Is there a determinant in terms of what?
There was just a change in the rules that allow, it used to be majority vote to put in and 2/3 vote to take out. There was just a change where some of the funds can now be voted on majority to take out. And that's new. We haven't dealt with that yet because it will be for an upcoming cycle. But it has been harder to take the money out and spend it than it is to put it in.
That'll help because, so this still, taking money out of these reserve funds requires a vote. Like in that video, it talks about the town residents as the legislative body for the town. We still need to vote to actually pull money out of these funds. So, and I know it's easy to say, well, Essex has 10 million, Essex is sitting on 10 million worth of reserves, or whatever that number is if you go down it. But, things like the bigger ones like OPEB were restricted. It can only be used for healthcare benefits of retirees. The sale of real estate is specific to real estate related expenses. Sewer free cash is part of the enterprise there. Stabilization fund really is kind of a rainy day fund. So, it is more kind of general use. There's also in here, let's see, this thing called reserve fund, which has a little over 100,000. The finance committee has discretion of using that reserve fund for, like, we need a new pump or something down at the water plant, and kind of like money is needed in a pinch. The FinCom can appropriate funds to be used from that reserve fund. But we just replenish that each year. But these are all sort of pretty specific purposes. I don't know if anybody has any questions or want to make any comments on any of this. Okay. Oh.
Brian Gressler, 30 Cho. So I just wanted, you said it right, but I wanted to repeat it because it's one of those things that gets said wrong a lot. And I think it's worth saying again that oftentimes you hear people say you can't use reserves for operating funds, and the answer is it's just not a good idea, right? Even as recently as FY23, Brendan, we were using it for healthcare costs, and we've been weaning ourselves off of that.
Yeah, and in the past, we actually used it to a greater extent. We got it down to zero, then it came back in a small amount. And what that's known as is a structural deficit, right? You've got something in your budget that you have no real revenue source for, and you're using one-time money for a recurring cost. Yes, it can be done, but it is not good practice.
I totally agree that it's not good practice. I just think people sometimes get into you hear out loud that somebody repeats through the game of telephone that you can't. And I just wanted to make sure we said that again so that people were, that's one of those things that's wrong.
No, thank you for saying that. I mean, it's like there's no absolutes in this world of municipal finance. Like there's asterisks everywhere. And so I think a lot of times people just want, like definitives. Like you either use free cash or you don't. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So that's right. All right, we have a slide here. We talked about the players involved, or at least that was introduced in the video in terms of the various boards, the structure. This is the Essex structure, and most of the financial operations and decisions do roll up to the Board of Selectmen in terms of approval of budgets, but also overseeing Brendan, who then is managing some of the financial functions that show up on this chart. So in terms of the org chart, this is basically, these are all the different people that are involved in the financial decision-making for the town. Notably, the tax collection function as part of the town's staff on the left, Finance Committee, Board of Assessors, rolling up to the Board of Selectmen. This is kind of interesting, and sort of Brendan and I were sort of going back and forth in terms of the town. There's 32 full-time employees working in the town of Essex. A lot of those are actually, so there's 32 full-time employees. There's actually about 125 total employees because so many of the employees are part-time. And so a lot of the functions of the town actually are covered by a fraction of a full-time equivalent, basically.
Right, and you also need to consider that there's about 50 call firefighters in the fire department who may not work at all in a given week. So that's a large part of that 125 right there.
That's about 50, right?
Yeah, about 50, and then you take out the 32 full-time, and there's various and sundry part-time employees that cover different things.
And then one of the things that I'll say this about Brendan is that he owns a lot of the functions that in other towns would typically be full-time employees, like HR, IT, grants, and what am I missing? Facilities, purchasing. So he wears multiple hats, and so if you take him as an FTE, it would probably add up to 3 realistically, but it's, that on a chart like this, it shows up as, that you would break out his role as sort of functionally encompassing a number of things. So, that's one of the challenges in our town, right? And we see this with the police department. There's a heavy reliance on part-time officers versus full-time officers. You take a community like Beverly where they're going to have a whole slew of full-time officers, and we just don't have a lot of flexibility being a small town in terms of our personnel. So basically the flexibility comes through a part-time employee structure for many of the different roles needed to run the town. So I don't know if anybody wants to add anything.
And I'll mention that change on the stabilization fund, where it's now a majority vote to take out, that was just passed on December 4th. So even the fall town meeting that we held on November 13th was still beholden to a 2/3 vote on a stabilization fund. It is still a 2/3 vote to create a stabilization fund. But then it's majority vote to put money in, and it used to be 2/3 to take money out, but it is now majority to take money out. Again, brand new.
So that would be extenuating circumstances, basically, with which we would pull from that. I don't recall taking money out of it in the last.
Well, no, well, all of these are, but all of these mini funds are forms of stabilization fund.
Oh, I see what
And
you're
that,
saying.
that
Okay,
new
I
law.
thought you were talking about the
No,
one.
no, well, that new law does apply to the general stabilization fund, but also all those small funds.
Okay,
Whereas in just a few months ago, it would have been a 2/3 vote to take any money out of any of those funds.
got it. Thank you. All right, I wanted to quickly cover the town's debt schedule. This is the debt service, the annual debt service of the town over time, going out to 2050, and you can see the different uses of debt for the town in the different colors. So I don't know if you can read this, but the lighter blue is the town hall renovations. That actually drops off in fiscal '23, so we have a bit of a drop starting in fiscal '34. We also have a drop that's going to be happening as the sewer project rolls off, and that is going to be happening in fiscal '27. And then the Memorial Elementary, which is looking out a distance, is 2050. So there are kind of three key dates in which we see a drop. But you can see the general, we pay, the debt service, we're paying off principal and interest each year. It's a little bit like your mortgage, where your overall indebtedness goes down over time. And that's what you see in this debt schedule. So I think when we're making decisions, particularly capital decisions about spending, it's helpful to be aware of this and sort of, is there optimal timing to actually start projects? And what's the impact going to be? I just thought I wanted to illustrate that. I also wanted to illustrate how does Essex compare to other towns in terms of our debt service. And there's a lot of numbers in here, but it's quite interesting. We are, in terms of our indebtedness, we're basically in the bottom third of the county, of Essex County, if you look at all the different municipalities. I wouldn't read a whole lot into this. I do think we are pretty conservative in terms of our use of debt. We've had some flexibility through the sale of real estate fund, and we've utilized that for things like offsetting the public safety building, which, was a way to limit the amount of debt that had to be issued for that. Different towns are at different points on their cycle in terms of having to make capital improvements to their physical assets. Our public safety building dated from the 1950s, so that was long overdue. Other towns, you look at Ipswich, where their debt actually just spiked up. Other towns like Marblehead, you typically don't see a town you don't generally exceed 15% in terms of your debt service relative to your budget, because that just sort of spirals you toward a difficult situation. But you can see kind of Essex is not really unusual. Manchester's lower, Hamilton and Wenham are lower. I think Manchester has some capital projects that they need to embark on, so that number will probably go up in the next few years. I think one of the good things is that a lot of our projects are actually in the rearview mirror in terms of the upgrades. Not to say we aren't going to need to spend money. We are going to need to spend money. I think we all know the next big outlay is going to be Essex Elementary. But I think this is just a helpful, I think it's always helpful to compare where a town stands relative to other towns. And that's it. So that's the prepared material. Happy to kind of engage and talk about any aspect of town finance. Hopefully this was helpful. I don't think we have many people on online.
There's a question, what are the pros of having so many reserve accounts, I think? Reserve funds,
Pros and cons.
pros and cons? See in the chat.
Yep, I see it. That's a good question. I think that the question is, what are the pros and cons of having so many different funds? And I think that it's a form of instilling discipline. I think that's the pro, so that you're earmarking specific funds for specific purposes. And we know, particularly like things that go through a cycle, like vehicles, emergency vehicles. We fund our own ambulance. We have an ambulance fund, which is one of those that it's a reminder each year that we have to accrue for that liability that's periodically going to come up. Our preference would be to not have to issue debt in order to be able to fund that purchase. And I think it's great that we were able to pay for a fire truck without having to pay for any, financing costs, because at this point in time, you have, with interest rates higher, you'd end up paying a pretty hefty premium to the cost of that outlay. But, it makes it more confusing. I think that's the
I think I
clear
can
con.
add to it as well. In the past, we've seen town buildings before we renovated this building and built a new public safety building. There would be a lot of deferred maintenance because the town, okay, well, we built it, but we really can't afford to do that right now, and moved on. From the beginning of either the renovation of the building or the building of the construction of the new public safety building, for example, we've tried to get these funds in place and periodically put money in so that when that next thing comes, there's money there and it's not a shock. It came out of some previous year and it's waiting to address the need, as opposed to just deferred maintenance that just keeps going and actually becomes a larger cost because you didn't deal with an issue when it would have been easier and more cost effective to do so.
Yep, thank you. And I will also say it sort of precedes my time. It's one of those things about Essex. We've always had all of these funds. I don't know when it actually started, but yeah, Brian.
Sorry, Brian Gressler, 30 Choate. I've got a couple of questions. So, in a lot of these overall town budget discussions, we've talked about distressed communities and trying to protect distressed communities. So, I think one of my first questions is a purely technical one. So, we have an annual town survey, and we know what properties get taxed. So, have we ever done a legitimate analysis and understanding of where, even within how demographically our tax income or tax revenue breaks out amongst certain demographic groups? And that's a lead-in to a question about tax deferral and abatement programs and ways to help those distressed communities. But first we need to understand what they actually are and how many of them there actually are.
No, we've never done a formal study of that nature.
Okay. So, I think that would be useful because we talk about helping these groups, but then we had one thing on annual town meeting, and we tabled it. There are other programs, there are deferral programs and other things like that aren't necessarily funded by the state and require seed funding internally within, but are worth looking at. And I think as part of an overall discussion about the whole of the budget and where expenses are, I think this is equally kind of important to make sure that if we think this is a problem, then let's actively look at ways to at least address it and then bring that to the town and see if we're willing to cover the costs of that. So I think if you then roll that back into override discussions, right? So, Ben, we were at a public hearing, and the town administrator from Manchester talked about kind of setting up a more steady, planned override, a series of small overrides, right? Getting to a point, and then knowing that every X to Y years, 3 to 5 or whatever it was, you're going to do a series of smaller overrides in order to better manage kind of the fluctuations of budgets. We haven't done an operational override since 2003 or a school one since 2006, right? So I think that I'm kind of curious. At the time, you nodded your head and had a discussion with him, that wasn't a horrible idea. So I'm kind of curious what we think about that approach versus the approach we've been taking.
Yeah, he's mentioned that actually a number of times in different forums, collaboration. I think it might be easier to implement that in a town like Manchester than in Essex because, as you just stated, we don't have a great track record around overrides. So that could be difficult. But I also think, from an expectations management, there's probably an upside there. To doing it that way. But I would invite others on that question if people want to opine, because this is a discussion and it's not overly formal.
What are we going to serve?
You want to say something, Ruth?
Well, I think, Brian, when you talk about a series of small overrides that was mentioned by Town Administrator Fetterspiel in Manchester, that's very specific to the school in the operating budget of the school. And I think tonight, from the town's perspective, we're talking about the town of Essex and how we manage our funds. I think in doing a lot of research about our town in general, we've found that some of our departments aren't keeping pace with the wage and salary scale of other communities. If we were going to be looking at an operational override, I think we need to look within our own departments first. I think I could very comfortably tell you that we have a Board of Health administrator that's probably underpaid. We have a police department where, many of them may be underpaid. We have a clerk and a treasurer collector that are far below where they need to be. So I think that we want to make sure that we're talking about everything as a whole and not just specifically about little overrides to fund our school.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about everything as a whole. Because I did say that we hadn't done an operational override for the town since 2003. So I do think that my question was meant as a general thought about that philosophy, be it school, town operating expenses, or otherwise, is that, because we are currently using the opposite model, what are the thoughts of this group of that operational model since it's come up in discussion?
Oh, I apologize. I thought you were, Greg's comment was specifically for the school.
No, in general, right? Because it's been just as long, and I think there are internal problems, and I think you could theoretically, I'm not sure if you can do it with a regional district, but I know that towns without a regional district have lumped overrides that combine operations and schools into one override too,
So I would also comment that naturally overrides are done through town meeting. Mm-hmm. And when overrides are brought forward, it's the townspeople that have the opportunity to vote on that. And when we brought them forward, they either pass or fail. So that's not any of your elected officials that make that decision ultimately. We can bring it forward, but it's your townspeople that vote.
But we haven't, I don't think we've brought a town operational one forward since the last one passed in 2003.
I think it was 2005. It's somewhere around there. I think it was 2005.
I looked at DLS. I think
it's been quite a few years. Yeah. Correct.
So we are making a conscious decision to not bring them forward, I guess is my point. That was my philosophy question. That's fine. I think my last one was there's a risk that we get to and this one is specific to the schools, that we get to a super town meeting that occurs after spring town meeting here and when funds are already allocated, and that results in an unplanned expense to the town. What are we doing to plan for and mitigate that risk? Where would the funds come from if all of a sudden there was in August an unexpected bill after spring town meeting? Where would the funds come from, and what are we doing now to mitigate the risk of having those funds available should that risk be realized?
Yeah, that I can actually speak to, because at our last finance committee we talked about the need to have a bifurcated budget in terms of as we embark on our liaison roles in terms of talking to different town departments, we basically have to figure out how to make a budget work that is going to could be under sort of a normal circumstance, or where we're looking at a school budget that would be along the lines of what's been proposed in the preliminary budget. Or I realize that those are still fluid right now, but if this ends up going to a super town meeting and we end up having to pay for something, it's our responsibility as a finance committee to make sure that we know how we're going to actually be able to address that liability or that cost. And it's going to mean making tough decisions. And so we're going to need to agree on where do those tough decisions need to be. And I think, so the lens with which we look at each department needs to be under that scenario of the Supertown meeting.
I mean, but so is it even possible to pull out of stabilization if we were at that point and things like that?
Well, yeah, and that may actually bring back the question of the override, because the unintended consequence is if you end up, squeezing the sponge so tightly that, we can't attract and retain employees at the town because, we can't pay people because of, as we just talked about, we may need to have a broader override just to kind of keep the town competitive as an entity. So, I think it would have to be a combination of stopgap and behavior change in terms of what we actually see. So the short answer to your question is yes, and that adds a different complexion to this year's budget season than past years.
All right. I think I'm good. I think just in summary, right, I think what I was trying to get to in that whole arc was, I'd like to kind of dig deeper into, that we dig deeper into some of those ways to help the distressed communities we keep talking about, and beyond just the one thing that was on annual town meeting. And there are potential implications for that other parts of the tax base might have to cover the cost of that. And I think that's a question for the taxpayers. But I think though, it's hard to talk about all of these things without, individually, right? They go together. If we care about those distressed communities, but we also care about paying a fair wage to the police officers, then I think both of those conversations have to go on.
No,
at the same
understood.
time. Yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Jake Foster, School Street. Want to follow up on a couple of Brian's questions about Proposition 2.5 and kind of the philosophy of how we operationalize that. I think one of the challenges that we have is that we often talk about as a kind of a hard limit, and we use that limit language a lot. And particularly given the history of not having broad overrides, right? People kind of view it in that frame of mind as an extraordinary thing to pass. Another way of looking at Proposition 2.5 is to view it as a way to manage inflation, particularly as we get into years, like we're experiencing now, where inflation all around us is going up well over 2.5. And I was wondering how you all, as a board and a committee, think about Proposition 2.5. Do you think of it more as a limit or as a process to manage inflation? Or when might you apply one thinking versus another?
I think of Proposition 2.5 actually as a framework or a discipline that allows for coordination among different players as far as expectations around how the budget actually gets managed. So it creates sort of a universal language. And it is a way to, particularly as people are feeling squeezed because of inflation, it's a way to, keep that somewhat in check in terms of at least the tax part of it. But it's an interesting question just in terms of thinking about it. I just think about it as a framework and, operating within that framework. but I invite others.
My short answer is I think of it as a guardrail. I think of it as a target that we shoot for. We try to operate within it, and it helps us if we can fall below it, great. If we have to exceed it, we bring it to town meeting. So I'm not opposed to overrides or small overrides on a regular basis. I just don't want to make that the habit because I think overrides traditionally have been difficult to pass. And it's the same thing as trying to, it's like trying to assume the number for free cash or for what excess capacity is or new growth. It's a guess. So I don't want to budget based on an unknown. I would rather base it on Prop 2.5. And then if we have to look forward, we're not destabilizing our community by using stabilization. So back to another point that I didn't answer. Using stabilization is certainly something we can do. If we end up at a super town meeting and we are forced into that situation of having to fund something that we didn't vote for in an override situation, we would have to look at stabilization accounts, realizing that those are savings accounts. They are not refunded automatically, so it's the same thing as using free cash. And you are going to deplete it in the next year. You are going to need that money, plus whatever the growth of the school budget is, essentially destabilizing the your own local economy. So I think of Prop 2.5 as guardrails, and it's a target to shoot for, in my opinion. It's kind of the short, long answer.
And I also think it's an opportunity too, because if you think about that formula and you think about the new growth, and I think, and Jody may have actually have something to say about this just based on her experience from the Economic Development Committee, is like, what do we need to do in Essex to actually, to get our new growth number higher? I mean, we know we have limitations just, we have a lot of conservation land. We don't have a lot of, buildable land like other towns do. So, are there things we could be doing that, to bump up the growth equation? So that's the opportunity part of it. I think the 2.5%, and then our historic struggle around overrides, that may be the more limiting or constraining part of the equation. So I think I start with 2.5% and then plus opportunities and limits.
Well, I also think, though, that last year, I think the town demonstrated, we were all in with our, all of our excess capacity. I think we left 20,000 on the table before we got to the override scenario. So that was 7 or 8 years worth of excess capacity that, again, the taxpayers weren't taxed on that over those 7 or 8 years, but in order to bridge that gap, we were willing to use the whole kit and caboodle for 1 year, where I think when I joined FinCom, Ben was actually looking at that excess capacity to hopefully get us to this, structural, override or a smoothing of, this structural issue that, we use the entire thing in 1 year. I also think about inflation, not just from town departments, but I look at it from the taxpayers. They're all suffering from inflation as well. So it's really hard to squeeze, both ends, especially when you have used your excess capacity. As far as new revenue for the town, part of what we're waiting for is the zoning project to progress. Essex has a lot of capacity issues. We have a call fire department that a lot of people who live in this town who have moved here in the last 10 years are shocked to learn that. They think we have a full-time fire department. In fact, Manchester FinCom members were shocked to hear that we didn't have a full-time fire department. We have limited sewer capacity. We live on the marsh. We have a lot of green space, which, in a conversation in the assessor's department, I was told when I was doing my tour for EDC that green space could literally bankrupt our town. As you take more and more of those parcels off the tax rolls, we're shrinking that tax base. So it's going up for the rest of us. We're in a very unique situation with a very tiny town government. I think we have extraordinary challenges, and we're old Yankees, so we like to pay for things, right? We like to pay cash for that fire truck. We own our equipment. We do not lease things, we buy things. We do not borrow if we do not have to. We tuck away year over year until we can actually afford things. And I think it's been a great model for Essex.
And Jake, you mentioned that the 2.5% as an inflationary point.
Mike, because we're live and recording, you have to get to the microphone.
As an account, the 2.5%, if you go back to where it came from, that was the long-term goal for inflation in America has been 2%. So it's 2% inflationary plus a little 0.5% for growth. So you get into trouble when you're in the 3, 4, 5% above that. So again, the rationale was to keep level with long-term inflation and allow a little bit of that 0.5% for growth. So it is an interesting perspective the way you bring it up.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Jake.
Thanks, Jake.
Procedurally, can I ask a question as a community
Oh, yeah,
member,
you're part of
or
the tent.
Am I,
Just-
So
am I?
Nina, just do your name and address because we are recorded.
Nina McKinnon, Lowland Farm. So I had a question, and I think it's coming up because we're hearing about the override that did not pass. But we did see the slide that our taxes, on average, people saw a 7% increase of their taxes. Offhand, can anyone remember if the override had passed, what people's taxes would be? But the override didn't pass.
We have to remember, you probably wouldn't have used all that levy capacity, so there would be some offset. It might not be that different.
Okay. And so from that, I guess my other follow-up, and I should disclose I'm on the finance committee, so to Ben's 7 years, I have 3.5 years, so I know some of these terms more. So what are the consequences, and I'm asking this more from the public standpoint to understand, what are the consequences or impact the fact that we've used up all our levy limit in the 1 year? I think, Jody, you just said we have 20,000 remaining as we look forward.
I would say that I don't want to put a negative spin on it, but it's just another constraint that we're operating under in terms of evaluating budgets going forward. I mean, the other thing that I didn't mention before, if you take the town's cost structure and most entities, municipal entities are like this. The school, I don't think, is any different. You look at the structure of those costs. You have human expenses. You have personnel, and then you have other expenses. And the personnel costs are collective bargaining. They're contractual costs. So we know that we have built in to a certain layer of our budget a 2% increase. And so then you don't really have levers on those things that have been collectively bargained. So you're looking at the other expenses in terms of belt tightening. So it is, you kind of have to look at the whole picture without having that. I mean, the thing is, historically, we haven't really used levy capacity other than extenuating circumstances like a failed override. So just in terms of an annual budget process, it's not hugely different, but I mean, it is, we've just lost a layer of flexibility. That's all.
Right, and there was a year where the town of Manchester did have to go for an override around the school, and the town didn't, and it was because there was levy capacity at the time. We should also mention that there are a number of things that over time have been kind of entrained into the budget. So when the Canoma Point leases were a new thing, and we went from about $110,000 a year to $500,000 a year on only 1/3 of the property, by the way, that was a new source of revenue. When we went from running our own dispatch to the regional dispatch center, that was saving like $300,000 a year. All of those things over time have been put to bear on increasing costs, in addition to levy capacity that we managed to save from year to year. But if you look at the inflationary environment, that is most times well beyond 2.5%, those are just some other things that we've been able to use, but they've kind of all run their course now. They're all entrained fully, and they're not going up anymore. They're fully counted on. So, it's definitely going to be quite an important discussion as we head into what we're doing now, this 25 budget.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Well, feel free to reach out individually, and I appreciate everybody coming here. Do we have another question?
Teresa has a question.
Oh, Teresa, you can we take an audio stream, or do you want to type it in?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I'll turn my volume down so it doesn't mess up with you. Is that better?
You're good. We can hear you.
Yep, we can hear.
My question, I just have a couple specific questions. What was the percentage of the total budget last year that was free cash that came back?
Well, I think our free cash number was 2.4 million.
Yeah, so that's around 10%. Rough numbers, right? On a
Right, on the 23.
2.4 million
basically on the 23.
On the 20 million, yeah.
Yep.
2.4 on the 20, so a little over 10%?
Right.
Free cash? Okay. Question about OPEB. When are you using from it now, or are you still funding, and at what point do you think you're going to get to a point of maturation so that you can actually be using from it?
Yeah, there's actually, I think it gets done every 3 years. There is an actuarial report that gets updated, which has the liability date. I want to say that it sort of starts in the 2030s.
Yeah, and I mean, up until this point, it's been pay as you go. So we've always had to pay for retiree health insurance costs, but we're paying as we go, cash every year. The goal is knowing that people are going to live longer, so there'll be theoretically more retirees alive to pay. If you can amass a certain amount of principal, then that money, the interest that comes from that, goes to pay what is going to be a growing cost of the town. And that was recognized many years ago. And so it's like doubly beneficial because A, the cost is going up, and B, we have a way to pay that larger cost without actually hitting current year funds. So OPEB, when we get there, and I think that's why Teresa's asking about it, will be a way to relieve a portion of costs that the town is paying year to year. But until it matures to a certain point, and we haven't gotten there yet, I think we need to talk to our actuary and our financial advisor about recommendations around that. We're in a growing phase, not in a using phase, but there will be a time fairly soon that we need to understand what would be prudent in that
Right,
area.
because then we have the benefit once. So right now it's about 50% funded, give or take. I think when I started on the FinCom, it was about 25% funded, but we've been sort of putting a portion of the free cash each year has been going into OPEB, sometimes more,
And right now, the
sometimes
interest
less.
generated rolls into the fund to help get to the goal. So if you start using it prematurely, you're not going to get to the goal as quickly.
Right, but when we do get to the goal, and it becomes self-funding for what that future liability is going to be, we have the added advantage of not having to keep shoveling money into it. So that's why we've been trying to use the free cash.
And that's going to be the analysis. Like, do you keep growing and rolling in and getting there? Does that make more sense, and does that ultimately save you more money than to take a little bit out now but not reach the full self-funding status that we're trying to achieve, which is actually the accounting standard is pushing us to achieve it.
Do we have any employees that are drawing from it now, former or retired employees? Brendan, do you know?
No, the town is still paying as we go. So there's always a cost. So retired employees, if they're on the HMO retiree product, The town is funding 75% of that, they're paying 25% of that. If they're on the PPO or the more generous product, the town pays 60%. I don't think we have anyone
I
on
see what
that.
you're saying. That just comes out in our benefits.
Year to year,
Yeah, yeah.
pay as you go.
Yeah.
The goal is to have so much money in that account that no matter how big
takes
it
over.
gets,
It takes over
there's
as a
no
funding
more
source.
current
Yeah.
year money going in to pay for that cost. We always have had the cost, we always will have the cost. The standard is about getting it so that it's self-funding.
Right. Got it. Teresa, did you have another question?
I do. So just to clarify, though, we don't have a target date for when that plan is to take place. You're just reevaluating every few years?
Not yet, because the amount of money that the town is able to put in there on a year-to-year basis varies widely. And so it's hard to predict, because if you look at our contribution over the years, it's kind of noisy. Not
So
a
you don't
smooth
have a dedicated
increase.
contribution, a mandated, that you've agreed to in any way? Okay.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you on that one.
I'm sorry, so you don't have a planned out, like a dedicated specified contribution that you need to make
No.
based on?
No, while we're ahead of, like Ben said, we're ahead of the curve as compared to a lot of other towns. It's not possible to always say this much is going to go in. So there would have been more that went in this year, but we bought a fire truck because that had to happen. And it's been that way all along. We have made great progress, but it's not entirely predictable.
Yeah.
I just had one other question. Thank you for that. Regarding the levy capacity, I was surprised to hear how far back it went. I know we used excess capacity. So when was the last year that we established a levy at 2.5%?
Well, I'm not sure so the question was, when was the last year that it established the levy at 2.5%?
In other words, when's the last year that we fully levied what we were
Oh, I see what you're saying.
able to levy?
You know, Teresa, I'm going to have to take that as a follow-up, because I think that'll be either Chuck
I don't know
or Jeff.
offhand, but we'd have to look at each year and add that up. I can take that
That's all
down.
right. That's okay. It's a specific one.
I had
So
heard,
appreciate the help.
Jody had mentioned, I think that it dates back, but we can get, that's a factual question, so we can get an answer for that.
Thanks for that.
Yep.
Is there
Any others?
Any others?
Well, thank you all, and like I said, feel free to ask any questions. I think we need to close out, right?
Yes.
Or
I will make a motion to adjourn. All those in favor? Aye.
All right, and I'll make a motion to adjourn the Finance Committee.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.